I heard whispers and giggles around me. I started to pace around her living room manically, and I was getting scared. The visuals were getting more and more intense. I was not having a good time and just wanted this to be over. My memory gets really foggy at this point, but my fiancé grabbed me before I nearly jumped out of our window. She told me I kept telling her to grab her rifle and shoot me to end it. She told me she had to grab her handgun from me because I found it and was going to use it. This experience happened barely 2 days ago, and I'm still looping over the experience in my mind over and over again. I'm a pretty experienced user of these substances, so I knew what to expect for the most part. However, I was not at all ready for what happened that night. Some of what I'll be writing is what I remember, and other parts will be what I was told I did. This is the night everything changed for me, and I'm still dumbfounded and speechless over it. At around 5 p.m, I was hanging out with a friend of mine and her boyfriend, and we decided to have some mushrooms and just chill in her bed while listening to music. She split 3.5 grams of what she had between the three of us, and I decided to slowly eat mine over the course of 5 minutes. I was in a pretty good headspace that day. I was all done with spring term, and was on my couple-week break till summer term begins. So I chose to do this then and there so I wouldn't be worrying about schoolwork or stressing over day-to-day stuff. At 7:30 p.m, my friend mentioned having a vial of LSD, and I asked her if I could have a little bit. I asked for at least 150 micrograms. She agrees and leaves the room for a second before coming back in and asking me if I'm okay with her dosing it on a sugar cube. I told her it's okay. I started to get mild visuals and a body high from the mushrooms I took, so I thought why not add some Lucy to the mix. She leaves the room for the second time, and I'm talking to her boyfriend about concerts we've been to, relaxing, and having an overall good time in each other's company. My friend comes back and hands me the dosed sugar cube, and I pop it in my mouth and let it dissolve. I'm excited about what's ahead of me and happy I'm doing something other than sitting at home and mindlessly scrolling through Facebook till I pass out. After the cube dissolved, I got the most uneasy feeling that washed over me, but chose to ignore it. I sat on my friend's bed, and she decided to give me a foot rub, but that uneasy feeling wouldn't go away. At 7:55 p.m. out of nowhere, the acid hit me like a ton of bricks and was coming on strong. At this point, I had pretty strong visuals, but it was nothing I couldn't handle. I told my friend I had to go to the bathroom. As I got up, I felt like my visuals were getting more and more intense, but it still was nothing I couldn't handle. When I went into her bathroom, I felt my breathing getting heavier and heavier. I felt myself becoming more and more on edge. After I was done in the bathroom, I went back into my friend's room and cuddled with her and her boyfriend on her bed. It was at this moment my breathing became shallow and I started breathing heavily. My friend asked if I was okay, but I had a hard time talking and answering her question. I stumbled up from her bed and staggered to her bedroom door. Breathing becomes harder and harder. I stumbled out into her living room and started to hear voices. I heard whispers and giggles around me. I started to pace around her living room manically, and I was getting scared. At 8 p.m, my friend comes out into her living room and asks if I'm okay. I told her, "I don't know, how much did you give me?" She started to get nervous and I asked her again. She tells me, "I gave you a cube that I remember I already dosed about 3 times. I might have given you a lot." My eyes widened as a wave of anxiety washed over me. I asked, "How much is a lot?" She tells me she thinks she gave me 900 micrograms or more. My mouth drops and I shake my head at her. She starts to babble and make it all about herself, and at that point, I tell her to cut it out. The visuals were getting more and more intense, and I'm getting more and more anxious. Mind you, not only have I never had that much LSD, but I've never dosed that much in one sitting. I started dissociating and paying attention to what she was saying was hard. I looked at my phone and saw my fiancé had a super stressful day at work and was getting off work early. I texted her that my friend, who also happens to be my fiancé's other partner, accidentally gave me way more acid than she should have, and I want to be picked up from her place. My fiancé told me she was on her way, and at this point, my friend's boyfriend came out into the living room and noticed me manically pacing around and shaking. He asked how I was doing, and I babbled a little. He took this as a sign I wasn't doing well, and he got me a glass of ice water. I sat back down on the couch, and my friend tried to guilt me for being upset with her for knowingly giving me way more than she should have. I shake my head and start shaking some more. At this point, the voices picked back up, and I did my best to keep it cool, despite the fact I was getting super scared. The visuals were getting more and more intense. I was not having a good time and just wanted this to be over. At 8:25 p.m, my fiancé comes over and tells me to grab my things so we can leave. My friend and fiancé's other partner tried to tell my fiancé to not let me leave. I have no idea why she was doing that, and my fiancé tells her to shut up and that she isn't happy with her. Then my fiancé and I left the apartment. The moment I left the apartment building, the hallway began to morph and change. I got really scared. The visuals were super strong and overwhelming. I told my fiancé this and she told me to hold her hand. I stumbled around the hallway looking like a complete fool. I don't remember quite what happened between the time we left and the time we got to the car, but at this point, I was in the car with my fiancé. The visuals kept getting more and more overwhelming. The city at night was completely unrecognizable, and everything was morphing and changing. The streets kept changing color, and the buildings looked like they were breathing. Everything started to freak me out. I then started screaming and crying and wanting to go to the hospital. I screamed and my fiancé held my hand and told me to listen to the sound of her voice. This started to calm me down a little bit. She told me sweet nothings and was telling me overall pleasant things on the way to the hospital. Despite the visuals growing more and more intense, I had a feeling that everything was going to be okay when she did that. However, after a few minutes, I started to psych myself out when I heard a voice telling me this was permanent and that I was going to be in this forever. At 8:55 p.m, we made it to the hospital, and by the time we got there, I was too scared to leave the car. But my fiancée reassured me that we were going to be okay. She holds my hand and walks with me into the hospital, and we go to the front and ask to be seen. I got a bracelet and told my fiancé I wanted to sit down. We sat down in a far corner of the ER next to a few old people. This waiting room was packed with people and it started to make me panic and feel anxious. Once I sat down, I got this wave of disorientation. I couldn't recognize anything around me. I didn't know where I was or who I was at this point. And then the ego death came on. I conked out for at least 10 minutes. Once I woke, I took my shoes off and started kicking my feet and threw my cane to the ground. Everyone was staring at me, and my fiancé asked me what I was doing. I didn't recognize her at first, but once I processed what she said, I remembered who she was. I asked her, "What are we doing?" because I couldn't remember where we were or what we were doing. She told me we needed to wait a while to be seen, and I started bawling my eyes out and screaming. Every single person stares at me and I cry louder. A couple of minutes later, I asked my fiancé the same question. Evidently, I just kept looping and asking her the same thing over and over. I then stood up, with my shoes off, and started running around the waiting room with my shoes off, while unintelligibly screaming and crying and flailing my arms around. My fiancé stood up and grabbed me by one of my arms and asked me to sit down, and I guess I yelled no. She sat me down and asked the nurse if we could be seen. I apparently started chewing on my cane and then talking to it. My fiancé came back and told me that she mentioned that I take trazodone, and that should be enough to calm me down. So she came back and tried to tell me that, but I just repeated the same questions from earlier. She told me we needed to leave, so I bolted up from my chair without my shoes on and ran outside the hospital. When I got outside, a wave of intense fear washed over me. The visuals just wouldn't stop getting more and more intense, and I didn't feel like myself. My fiancé grabs my arm and walks me to the car. There were people near our car staring at me, and I started to freak out and scream at them, and my fiancé grabbed me by the arm and got me inside the car. Once we got inside and went on our way back home, I started losing consciousness and blacked out for portions of the car ride. My fiancé told me I wouldn't stop screaming and crying, that I want to end it all, and that I was going to be permanently like this. I even tried jumping out of the car when we were driving over a bridge. My fiancé told me I kept talking to myself, but it didn't make a bit of sense. I kept repeating the same sentences over and over and freaking out over everything. The moments I remember, I was freaking out about how intense the visuals were, and the voices in my head wouldn't stop. I wanted this to be over. I couldn't handle this. It was way too intense and strong. I felt angry at that friend for dosing me way too much in one sitting, especially considering she knew she already dosed that sugar cube. At that point, I lost my trust in her, It's 10:20 p.m. now, and at this point we were back home. My fiancé goes and looks for my bottle of trazodone to give to me. I kept flailing my arms around and knocking things over. I ended up breaking a prized possession of my fiancé's, and she got angry and sternly told me to sit on the bed and wait for her to give me those meds. Evidently, I got back up and ran to the bathroom where she was and started yelling loudly that I wanted to end it all. She told me to sit back down, and I ran back to the bed and knocked a bunch of other things down in the process. My memory gets really foggy at this point, but my fiancé grabbed me before I nearly jumped out of our window. Mind you, we live in a tall apartment building. I remember her crying and being angry that her other partner negligently gave me that much acid. She held me down and gave me trazodone, handed me a water bottle and told me to drink water. I took one sip and threw the bottle across the room. All I remember at this point was that I kept being really loud and breaking stuff. I also remember my fiancé being super sad and just done with my behaviour. At 11 p.m, the trazodone started to kick in, and I felt more like myself at this point. The visuals were still intense, but not like they were earlier, where I couldn't process anything around me and was overwhelmed. I was able to hold a conversation with my fiancé, and she asked me if I remember anything that had happened over the last few hours. I told her not really, just that it was way too intense and overwhelming. She fills me in on pieces I didn't remember, and then, when she mentions almost jumping out the window to end it all, I become really sad. She told me I kept telling her to grab her rifle and shoot me to end it. She told me she had to grab her handgun from me because I found it and was going to use it. I kept telling her over and over again that I wanted to be released from this hell. From here on out, I get no sleep whatsoever and am locked to my bed, looping over the events I remember in my head over and over again. I was stuck in my head for hours, listened to music and just kept thinking. My fiancé told me she was going to have a word with that partner and leave me alone since I was not in such a volatile state as earlier. That friend messages me on Discord and tries to make me feel bad for her over what happened, but I was not in the mood to talk to her. I couldn't believe she knowingly gave me that much, especially since she's an experienced user of this stuff. It just didn't add up. That was so irresponsible of her, and on top of that, she tried to make me feel bad for something she did. Once night turned into day, I felt different. I didn't feel like me. I felt like something changed in me, and I still had powerful visuals. The events of that night scarred me, and even now I just don't feel right. I've always known LSD is a powerful substance, but this whole experience taught me that this is not something to play with, and that you need to be careful. I've always wanted to try a heroic dose, but was definitely not ready for that experience. I hope I start feeling better soon. I just feel like a completely different person now.